this video, I'm going to teach you how to prepare and import an AutoCAD file to render. We're going to review how to define and apply material patterns and review how to add highlights and shadows. And then finally, we'll add entourage and scale figures to an elevation and add in a finish key. So I'm going to skip over here just to AutoCAD for a second and speak some AutoCAD language to you here. Oftentimes we have to bring in an AutoCAD file to render in Photoshop, and so often an AutoCAD file will look something like this, in which all of the different elements have been drawn on their specific layers, which will be assigned line weights and associated colors. And of course, we don't want any of that to come in when we render. And so what we have to do is save a copy of the file in which you can start to alter some of the line weights and colors. And basically, once you know that you have a file that no one else is going to touch besides you, or a file that no one will be mad if you disrupt all of the layer properties, then you're ready to begin. So you can see here, this is kind of the before, and then this is the after. And so what I did was I selected and deleted all of the hatch because I don't want that to come in on Photoshop. And so you can see here, all I had to do is just select and delete. Looks like I grabbed an extra line there. And then once that's done, then I have to make sure that all of the blocks are exploded so that I can change the color. And so all you're going to do is just you can grab all of the windows, or you can do it one by one, whichever you want. But you're going to first type in explode, select objects, right click, and now they should be individual units like that. Perfect. And then you can go ahead and type your match properties. And you can grab one of these white lines here. We know that they're going to be nice and thin. And then you can just go ahead and change everything. So once you have everything in exploded, and then all the lines have been turned white, you should have something that looks like this, and all the hatches removed, of course, too. So once you have that done, all you need to do is go ahead and plot it. And so you can just set up, I usually just do an Adobe PDF, and I create a window. And then this is almost ready to go. What we have to do is just get it a little bit smaller on our sheet, because that way we can crop it down and have a little bit more room for labels. So you can adjust your scale a little bit and figure out the best size, but I'll have one of these already ready for you for your assignment, but I just wanted to have something to show you so that you could see how to create a file like this that's ready for Photoshop. So once we've got that ready, then we can just go ahead and hop on over to Photoshop. I'm going to bring in that document here. And you can see that I have actually moved it over a little bit because we're going to add some labeling to the side over here as well. And you can see I've also brought in a series of textures that I have downloaded, and you can see these are seamless. These are what I'm going to use to apply to this exterior rendering. And so as we've done in the past, I'm going to click on that image, and I'm going to go down to edit and define the patterns. And so it comes in with a file name, but I'm going to just rename it brick. And we will do the same thing with the roofing. And we are going to also have some concrete. And I'm also going to bring in some travertine as well a little bit later for the front facade. But for right now, we've got a review of how to define patterns, and now it's just a matter of applying them. So I'm applying these based on a visual reference that I have that I've changed just a little bit. But what you need to keep in mind is that we have this facade that we're going to do in brick, and then the roof, of course, will be that shingle. The things that would typically be stone in a, an academically historically correct example, we're going to do in concrete, so that when you touch them, they kind of have that feeling of strength. We're not going to actually make them out of stone. And so that's going to be the columns and the balustrade over here. And then we're also going to give that same look of stone for the window, the top and bottom of the window. And then there's actually going to be a fair amount of paint in here as well. So let's just go ahead and begin. I'm going to start with the roof. Now, the only issue with the roof is that the pattern itself here is not sort of condensed as it would be in a perspective like this, right? Because even though this is not in perspective, pardon me, it would not be condensed in an elevation such as this. But you can see here, it's not in perspective, but it is an elevation of an angle. So it would actually be squished down just a little bit. But for right now, I'm not going to worry with that. I'm just going to go ahead and define the pattern. So I'm going to make sure my layer is selected, and I'm going to go ahead and grab all of my roofs. I'm holding down the shift button so that I can grab a few of them at a time. I'm going to grab my clipping mask over here and create a pattern. And we're going to use the roof that we have defined. And you can see it's a rather large scale. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit. A little more. That looks pretty good. Now with that layer, as we've done in the past, we're going to make sure that we have that inner shadow turned on. We'll make sure that the blend mode is set to normal. Opacity, I'm not going to change the opacity right now because we'll barely be able to see it anyway here because the material itself is so dark. So I'm going to just leave it there for now. Then the next thing I'm going to do is apply the brick. Now, there is quite a big area here, but it should select and define its pattern quite nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this. You can see it's selecting and grabbing. I'm also going to grab this part over here because this is the chimney. Okay. But the rest of this I'm going to leave. That's going to be stone. Okay, so then same thing here. We're going to define the pattern. And we're going to select this brick. Now, bricks like this are, usually about 3 or so inches tall. So we have to scale this down quite a bit so that it looks correct based on the scale of the house. I got pretty lucky there. 23, maybe 25, just a little bit bigger. 23 is good. Okay, so we've got that selected and it looks great. But actually, I'm gonna cancel this for a second and I'll show you why. I want to be able to convey a sense of depth with this chimney back here. So I'm actually going to define them separately. First, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do this, and you'll see why in just a second. Okay, so you can see I've selected my inner shadow. I'm going to bring it out just a little bit. I'm going to increase the size just a little bit. Okay, so now you're getting a little bit of depth added to it. And now you'll be able to see if I go back to this layer and I select this now. The element of depth will kind of reveal itself a little bit more since these are two separate elements. It can be helpful to remember the scale of things. If you have a little notepad next to you, then you can make sure that everywhere that you're applying the scale, the pattern, that you get the scale the same on each one. Sometimes that can be helpful. So I'm going to double click and grab that inner shadow. And again, I'm trying to keep the inner shadow the same. Looks good. Actually, I'm going to tone it down just a little bit. There's a small amount of like mass filled in there, and so it's kind of, the shadow's looking a little bit too dark because there's a limitation on the thickness of space here. Okay, and then the next thing I'm going to do now is come in with the stone around, and that's going to take me a little bit of time because I have to grab each one of those individual balusters and some of the columns. So I'm going to pause for a second and grab those elements, and we'll be back when they're done. Okay, so you can see here that I have selected all of these elements. Look at all those marching ants, that's what we call them. But everything is selected. Now, I was holding down my shift button while I selected these. And if I grab something that I didn't mean to select, all you have to do is Control Z or undo. And it'll go back just one click. So you don't have to like reselect everything all over again. So I've got a lot selected right here. So let's go for it. We're going to define this pattern, and this is going to be kind of this concrete color. And we're going to, the scale itself looks pretty good, but it definitely needs a little bit of shadow added to it. Once you get used to applying a shadow and seeing it, then you sort of really miss it when you don't see it. Okay, so you can see it's pretty good. There's a couple of areas here where it looks a little bit too dark because, again, it's in a small area. Now, if I wanted to separate the size so that around the windows it was a little bit less shadow, and then around these larger areas it was more, I would have to do two separate commands, first around the windows and then around the other areas. And so you kind of have to do a little bit of thinking as far as process goes and how you want things to look, so that you end up with the results that you want. But of course, it's just as easy to undo and just start all over again. I'm going to leave it as is for now. And then what I want to do next is I want to go ahead and add in some travertine here on the front facade. And so I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And sometimes portals like this are treated a little bit differently than the rest of the facade itself. And so that's why I'm just kind of giving a sense of entry here. You can see a couple of things. The first thing is you can see there's a little bit of a line in the distance where that outer shadow is coming out. So let me go ahead and fix that, show you how to fix that right now. The distance is 8 pixels, and so there's like 8 pixels over there. So I'm going to pull this out just a little bit. See how it moves? And we want the shadow to start right at that line. So maybe 1 pixel off, but that's one thing I want you to notice. And then the other thing is you can see there's an extra line here, and that could be defining many things right now. It's unclear exactly what that line is defining, but it's going to mess up kind of my application of pattern here. And so all I'm going to do is just create a little marquee here. You can do a marquee or you could do an eraser. I tend to do a marquee when I can get away with it. But I'm going to get a little too close. Let me zoom in. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make sure I'm on the right layer first. And then I just want to fill it. I don't want to create a new layer. I just want to put some white on top of that. And we'll fix this one over here too. Now you want to make sure, this is a great time to talk about this. You really want to make sure that you bring in as much as corrective in AutoCAD or any kind of file into Photoshop before you start rendering. Because let's say, for example, worst case scenario, the client hated this and you had to start all over. Well, you might not delete all of the layers. You might not change the layers necessarily. You may just bring in a whole new version of the AutoCAD file. And so all of those mistakes that you fix, like this one that I just fixed, you have to duplicate that work again. So just be really mindful, take a good look at your file before you start rendering it. And then think about kind of setting up your layers and how they're made to respond to changes. You know, simple things like just being able to change the pattern or deleting the layer, but you want to do very little kind of cosmetic fixes to the underlying file as possible so that you don't have to waste your time with too much of that. Okay, what I want to talk about now is I want to zoom in a little bit on these windows here. We'll talk about how to finish those next. So each of these windows are the same. And so I'm going to show you how to do one. And you can then either merge the layers and copy and paste the layers and kind of stick them on top of the existing windows, or you can do this as a full sequence. However you want to approach it is fine, but just know that I have to grab a lot of individual elements across a lot of individual windows. So the shutters in a situation like this could be colorful if you wanted them to. Right now, I'm going to focus though on the frames of the windows. I'm going to make sure those are black. And you're just barely going to get any of the inside pixels of those. If you can't quite grab it, that's okay. I'm also going to grab this piece and this piece. Okay, now for here, we don't actually need a pattern. What we do need though is just a color. So we can do we should be able to create our same, we can do a clipping mask, that's fine. I really just want to fill, but it's not going to give me that option to do that. So we're going to, instead of defining pattern, we're going to define a solid color. And then I'm going to, even though I want it to be black, I'm going to do not black. I'm going to do a kind of a dark gray so that the lines still show up that define the window itself. And so that I'll be able to get a little bit more of kind of that shade and shadow effect, because again, I don't want it to look too flat. Okay, so again, we're going to do that on all the windows. And then same thing here, you know, inner shadow. Even if you can't see it very well, we want to still make sure that it's there and that it's going to just give a little bit of emphasis to those. Okay, and then what I want to do next is go back to my original layer, and I'm going to grab the, let me go ahead and grab the, let me see if it'll let me do it here. No, it's not going to let me. And the reason is because Photoshop doesn't know that, Photoshop only knows how to create a layer by clipping based on an underlying layer. And so that's why it's not letting me do exactly what I want. If I want these to be on their own layer and unrelated to the CAD file underneath, then all I would have to do is just hit new layer here, and a new layer will be created, and then I can go ahead and select and create a marquee to create an infill. But because I want it based on the layer underneath, I can only do it using that like clipping mask. So for these, I am going to just fill them with a solid color. And they're going to just be a very kind of pale blue. And again, it's kind of hard to make this not look super cartoony. I'm going to bring it down the opacity. Now it's really a nice touch, and we'll learn it later, to put stuff in the window and then have the layer of glass on top. And you can see through it a little bit. Okay, and then same thing, shadows everywhere. And it just gives it see a little bit of softness. It looks so nice. Okay, now as far as the color goes, there's a part of me that wants to add a little bit of color to this, but I may chicken out, or I may get a little bit color shy and nervous, because so many of these Georgian houses are so restrained in their color palette. So what I'm going to do is just a kind of a dark gray for these elements here. And once again, I have to grab every individual part here because these are shutters. And so there's a little tiny bit of shadow under each one of those louvers. That's what those little overlapping pieces of wood are called. And so again, this is what makes a difference. This is what makes it look so good, is when you start to grab all those individual elements and take your time to render them beautifully. And so that's what we're going to do now. So see, I grabbed too much and I'm not sure what I grabbed. So I'm going to hit Control Z on my PC. And then I'm going to it'll undo that last selection. And then same thing. We're going to do a color because these would be painted. So we don't need a texture here. When we're thinking about paint, we just define the color itself. And so again, I'll bring this gray. Actually, yeah, they're practically matching. I was going to say I can do my eyedropper tool there. Make sure they match. And of course, add my shadow. Okay. Okay, so at this point, I would probably grab my design manager and I would say, okay, what do you think of this so far? Just to get feedback, because what happens next is going to be a lot of work to undo. And so I would just, if my design manager liked everything, then I would continue going through all the windows. For the trim over here, this part here and the part over here, in situations like this with this type of architecture, it's a lot of white. And so I would go ahead and just define and fill and add a shadow to the white areas here. And I might consider bringing in either a unique color of the door or being a little bit more subdued and having it match this. So I'm going to go ahead and pause and kind of infill a couple of other elements for you just to get an idea. And then we'll start to have fun with some of the entourage. Okay, so a couple of things I want to draw your attention to now. You can see that I duplicated all of my patterns on my windows. And basically what I did was I grabbed all of the layers that were related to that window, and I selected, like, let's just say, you can grab a couple of layers, and then you can right click and say merge layers. Now, once you do this, you can't undo it. So I merged all of the layers related to the window, and then I duplicated that layer, and then so you can right click and say duplicate, and then I just copied it over, and then I merged those two layers, and then I duplicated the layer, moved them down and duplicated and merged them. And then all of this was a single layer. I duplicated it and brought it all the way over here. And so now I have a single layer that's my windows on and off. So you can see I didn't grab the kind of the casing, the stone casing, concrete casing around the top. What I also did was I went through and applied a color to the trim areas. Now it's white, but it's not super, super white. It's kind of more of a cream color, and then again, added shadows to that. I applied a clipping mask, just like I've done with everything else. And I did that around the casing of these windows here, the transom above, and then these two side lights, and then infilled and added an inner shadow to the glass itself. I went in and did the same treatment to the door, and you can see I added a little bit of a brass handle there. And then I also defined a new pattern. This is called travertine here. And I defined that pattern, and then I brought it in here and scaled it up so that they were nice and big, because I'm thinking about the fact that the colors are very similar in these two patterns, and so I needed to change up the scale, again, thinking of the elements and principles of design. And so this is getting close to resembling something that we might be able to show a client. And so now that we have the kind of the colors applied where we want them, it's going to be time to apply some scale figures and entourage elements.